The 1970s produced some of the most successful songs in popular music history. They topped charts, dominated radio, and became unavoidable cultural moments. For a time, these records defined what success sounded like. But reputation is not permanent. As decades pass, songs are not only remembered, they are re-evaluated. Lyrics are reread. Intentions are questioned. What once felt sincere can begin to sound excessive. What once felt universal can feel uncomfortable, dated, or misunderstood. This shift rarely happens overnight. It happens quietly, through repetition, cultural change, and critical distance. Some songs don't disappear. They remain everywhere, and in doing so, they slowly lose the authority they once had. This documentary examines 10 hit songs from the 1970s whose reputations changed over time. Not because they failed, but because history began to hear them differently. Number 10. You're So Vain by Carly Simon, 1972. When Carly Simon released You're So Vain in 1972, the song arrived with an unusual sense of control. Its conversational tone felt precise rather than emotional, confident rather than reactive. In a decade dominated by grand political statements and theatrical rock personas, the song's restraint made it feel modern. At the time, listeners heard clarity. A narrator who appeared fully aware of ego, imbalance, and self-importance, and willing to confront them directly. But that authority weakened with distance. As cultural conversations around perspective and self-awareness evolved, the song's framing began to feel narrower. Its critique circles one unnamed figure so tightly that it eventually turns inward. Instead of exposing vanity, the narrative risks centering it, drawing attention not to behavior, but to personality. The famous ambiguity, once praised as sophistication, now functions differently. By refusing specificity, the song encourages speculation rather than understanding. The listener's focus shifts away from observation and towards celebrity mythology. You're So Vain never lost its popularity, but popularity isn't credibility. What faded was the song's balance. The confidence remains, but the insight feels thinner than it once did. That quiet imbalance is how a song begins to age. Number 9. We Are Family by Sister Sledge, 1979. When We Are Family was released in 1979, it reflected the lived reality of disco culture. Dance floors were more than entertainment spaces. They were social environments built on visibility, inclusion, and shared presence. In that moment, the song's message felt grounded. Togetherness wasn't theoretical. It was physical, communal, and immediate. The erosion came later. As the song expanded beyond its original context, its meaning gradually loosened. We Are Family was embraced everywhere. Sporting events, corporate branding, political messaging, often detached from the cultural spaces that first gave it weight. Over time, the message flattened. What began as affirmation became function. The song shifted from expression to signal, used to manufacture instant unity without engaging the complexities of belonging. Musically, it remains effective. Conceptually, it thinned. Its credibility didn't collapse through rejection. It dissolved through repetition. We Are Family now operates as a cultural shortcut, recognizable, dependable, and emotionally distant from its origins. It didn't age poorly. It aged safely. And safety is often where meaning fades. Number 8, Imagine by John Lennon, 1971. When John Lennon released Imagine in 1971, it was received as a moral statement rather than a pop song. Its melody was intentionally simple, almost fragile, designed to feel universal. The lyrics asked listeners to picture a world without borders, religion, or material division, an invitation framed as peace rather than provocation. At the time, the message resonated deeply. Post-1960s idealism had not disappeared. It had simply softened. Imagine sounded like a final appeal, less confrontational than protest music, more intimate than political slogans. But distance changed how the song is heard. As decades passed, the song's idealism began to feel detached from material reality. Its vision of peace depends on removal rather than resolution, offering abstraction instead of process. The song asks listeners to imagine outcomes without confronting the structures that prevent them. Cultural reevaluation also reshaped its credibility. Lennon's personal contradictions, his wealth, lifestyle, and distance from the conditions he sang about, became harder to ignore. What once felt aspirational now risks sounding performative, even naive. Imagine remains widely respected, but respect is no longer unconditional. The song didn't lose relevance because its message was wrong. It lost authority because it offered simplicity in a world that increasingly demanded accountability. What once felt profound now feels unresolved. That tension is why Imagine aged, not as failure, but as an unanswered question. Number 7, American Pie by Don McLean, 1971.
So bye, bye, Miss American Pie.
When Don McLean released American Pie in 1971, it positioned itself as both elegy and chronicle. The song attempted something rare in popular music, a condensed history of cultural loss, wrapped in a sing-along melody. For audiences still processing the end of the 1960s, it offered narrative where memory felt fractured. Initially, that ambition felt meaningful. Listeners didn't need to fully understand the references to feel the weight of decline. The song suggested that something essential had been lost, and that recognition alone carried value. Over time, however, the song's authority began to shift. What once felt symbolic gradually hardened into mythology. The lyrics became less interpretive and more self-protective, relying on obscurity as depth. As cultural literacy changed, the song's coded references began to feel exclusionary rather than poetic. Reevaluation also exposed a structural problem. American Pie frames cultural change as collapse rather than transformation. It mourns an imagined unity without interrogating who that unity excluded, or whether it truly existed. The song remains iconic, but its nostalgia feels increasingly fixed, resistant to reinterpretation. Where earlier generations heard reflection, later listeners hear idealization. Where once there was mourning, there is now distance. American Pie didn't age because it was wrong. It aged because its version of history stopped expanding. And history, unlike memory, refuses to stand still. Number 6, My Sharona by the Knack, 1979. When the Knack released My Sharona in 1979, it sounded deliberately uncomplicated. At a moment when rock culture was splintering, between punk minimalism, arena excess, and disco precision, the song cut through with blunt energy. Its tight rhythm, aggressive riff, and obsessive repetition felt physical rather than thoughtful. Initially, that directness worked. My Sharona was framed as youthful fixation, impulsive desire stripped of metaphor. It dominated radio not because it invited analysis, but because it refused it. Time, however, changed the listening position. As cultural conversations around power, consent, and representation evolved, the song's fixation began to feel less playful and more uncomfortable. The lyrics offer no interiority, no negotiation, only pursuit. What once read as adolescent urgency now risked sounding entitled, even predatory. The problem isn't simply the subject matter. It's the absence of distance. My Sharona never questions its own perspective. The song locks the listener inside desire without reflection, framing persistence as inevitability. That lack of self-awareness, once masked by energy, became impossible to ignore with age. Musically, the track remains efficient and influential. Culturally, it feels stranded. My Sharona didn't lose credibility because it failed artistically. It lost credibility because it refused evolution. What once felt raw now feels unexamined. And unexamined songs age faster than any other kind. Number 5, Hotel California by Eagles, 1976.
Welcome to the Hotel California.
When the Eagles released Hotel California in 1976, it was immediately framed as allegory. The song presented itself as mystery rather than narrative, an unsettling portrait of excess, temptation, and spiritual drift in post-1960s America. Its careful pacing and polished production gave it an air of seriousness that demanded interpretation. At first, that ambiguity worked in its favor. Listeners projected meaning onto the song, reading it as a critique of the music industry, California culture, or American consumerism itself. The lack of a fixed explanation created authority through suggestion. Over time, however, that openness hardened into self-importance. Repeated exposure transformed the song from unsettling to overdetermined. Its symbolism became so discussed, so canonized, that it lost flexibility. What once invited interpretation began to feel like a closed system, famous, heavy, and immovable. Cultural reassessment also exposed a tension in tone. The song critiques indulgence while luxuriating in it, condemns excess through immaculate production, and warns of entrapment while offering no alternative. The result is a critique that feels comfortable with what it claims to resist. Hotel California remains meticulously crafted, but its credibility now feels performative rather than confrontational. The song didn't age poorly because its message failed. It aged because its ambiguity stopped being risky and became ornamental. What once unsettled now reassures, and reassurance is rarely where lasting critique survives. Number 4, Macho Man by Village People, 1978. When Village People released Macho Man in 1978, the song functioned as both spectacle and satire. On the surface, it celebrated hypermasculinity through exaggerated imagery, theatrical vocals, and flamboyant performance. Beneath that surface, however, the song operated as coded parody, playing with gender roles rather than endorsing them. At the time, that ambiguity allowed the track to move freely across cultural spaces. It thrived in disco clubs while also crossing into mainstream radio, where its irony often went unnoticed. The song existed simultaneously as celebration and critique, depending on who was listening. But that duality did not age evenly. As cultural understanding of gender, identity, and performance evolved, the song's satire became increasingly unstable. Without its original context, the exaggeration can feel confusing rather than critical. The line between parody and endorsement blurred. For modern listeners, the song often reads literally. Its theatrical masculinity is no longer interpreted as subversion, but as caricature, sometimes even reinforcement of outdated stereotypes. This shift reveals how deeply satire depends on context. When the cultural environment that produces irony disappears, ambiguity becomes vulnerability. Macho Man remains infectious and visually iconic, but its message is now fractured. What once destabilized rigid gender roles can now appear to simplify them. The song didn't lose credibility through rejection. It lost coherence through misinterpretation. And misinterpretation, repeated long enough, reshapes legacy. Number 3, Lay Lady Lay by Bob Dylan, 1969. Although released at the end of the 1960s, Lay Lady Lay entered the cultural bloodstream of the 1970s as part of Bob Dylan's redefined public identity. By then, Dylan had already moved away from protest music, and this song was often cited as proof of his transformation, from political voice to private narrator. At first, that shift was welcomed. The song's warmth, restraint, and sensual tone felt mature, even vulnerable. It presented intimacy without confrontation, desire without rhetoric. For audiences fatigued by ideological intensity, that softness felt earned. Time, however, complicated the reading. As cultural perspectives on agency and power evolved, the song's language began to feel less gentle than it once did. The repeated requests, framed as invitation, increasingly sound one-sided. The song offers desire without dialogue, intimacy without interiority from the other voice involved. The issue is subtle, but persistent. Lay Lady Lay presents closeness as possession rather than exchange. What once felt tender now risks sounding static, an image of intimacy frozen in one perspective, without space for response. Musically, the song remains beautifully composed. Its credibility problem isn't technical, it's contextual. As Dylan's broader legacy grew more complex, this song's simplicity began to feel limiting. Where earlier listeners heard maturity, later ones hear avoidance, of conflict, of complexity, of mutuality. Lay Lady Lay didn't age into controversy. It aged into discomfort. And discomfort, unlike outrage, rarely announces itself. Number 2, Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, 1971.
There's a lady sure.
When Led Zeppelin released Stairway to Heaven in 1971, it was treated as a culmination. The song seemed to gather folk mysticism, blues tradition, and hard rock ambition into a single expanding structure. Its gradual build, from acoustic introspection to electric release, felt monumental, almost instructional. This was rock music presenting itself as serious art. For years, that seriousness went unquestioned. Stairway to Heaven became a benchmark for musicians, for listeners, for the idea that popular music could aspire toward transcendence. Its refusal to be a single or a simple song only increased its authority. But time altered the scale. As rock culture became institutionalized, the song's grandeur began to feel inherited rather than earned. What once felt mystical now feels rehearsed. Its symbolism, deliberately vague, invites reverence without clarity, depth without consequence. Repetition also reshaped perception. Played endlessly, discussed endlessly, the song hardened into doctrine. It became less an experience than an obligation, carried forward by reputation rather than discovery. Cultural reassessment exposed another tension. The song promises revelation, but withholds resolution. It gestures toward meaning without engaging the material conditions beneath it. In a later era, that gesture reads as evasion. Stairway to Heaven is still admired, but admiration is no longer innocent. Its credibility didn't collapse. It crystallized, untouchable, distant, and increasingly disconnected from the urgency that once made it feel necessary. When meaning becomes monument, it stops moving. Number 1, You Light Up My Life by Debbie Boone, 1977. When You Light Up My Life topped the charts in 1977, it did so with extraordinary dominance. The song wasn't just successful, it was overwhelming. It spent weeks at number 1, crossed generational boundaries, and became one of the decade's defining ballads. Its appeal lay in reassurance, soft certainty, emotional clarity, and spiritual warmth packaged as romance. At the time, that clarity felt comforting. In a decade marked by cultural fragmentation, the song offered emotional stability. It asked nothing difficult of the listener. Love, faith, and meaning were presented as unified, uncomplicated forces. But that simplicity did not age well. As popular music evolved, the song's emotional language began to feel overly resolved. There is no tension, no ambiguity, no risk. Every feeling is affirmed immediately, leaving no room for doubt or contradiction. What once sounded sincere now feels carefully insulated from complexity. Cultural reassessment also reframed the song's authority. Its framing of devotion, absolute, unquestioned, and externalized, reads less like intimacy and more like dependency. Meaning arrives fully formed, not discovered, and never challenged. You Light Up My Life didn't lose credibility because it failed musically. It lost credibility because it refused friction. In hindsight, the song represents a moment when comfort replaced inquiry, when reassurance stood in for insight. And time has shown that reassurance, however successful, rarely endures without question. These songs didn't disappear because they failed. They faded because culture kept moving. What once felt sincere became complicated. What once sounded universal revealed limits. Time didn't reject these records. It questioned them. If this reevaluation resonates, subscribe for more documentaries where music history is remembered and re-examined.